Clearly, Operation Barbarossa and the subsequent clash on the Eastern Front were the backdrop of the wildest scenes of World War II. When Hitler decided to invade the nation led by Joseph Stalin, he anticipated a quick and easy victory, but encountered a real hell that ended up consuming countless soldiers' lives. In this edition of Military History, we want to present this turning point in full color, as you've never seen it before, giving it a new dimension. Prepare to experience the conflict firsthand. Amongst the land, fire, blood, and fear. Let's begin this impactful presentation. The relationship between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union was a decisive factor in the development of World War II. In the 2 years leading up to Operation Barbarossa, both countries had signed political and economic pacts for strategic purposes. Despite the vast ideological distance and Hitler's declared intentions to expand eastward, in 1939 they formalized the well-known Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, named after the foreign ministers of each nation. In this document, Germany secured the neutrality of the Soviet Union in exchange for ceding half of Poland, Bessarabia, and the Baltic states. Additionally, the Soviet Union claimed control of the Dardanelles Strait, Finland, and the possibility of opening bases in Denmark. Essentially, Eastern Europe was divided between Moscow and Berlin.
Steadily, his armies were redeployed to the east and re-equipped for what would be their greatest challenge.
The Soviet advance in the Baltic led to a strain on the neutrality agreement by threatening, from the German perspective, the supply of iron from Sweden and nickel from Finland. Although the Soviet Union had generally adhered to the treaty, particularly in sending raw materials to the Third Reich, Soviet territorial ambitions unsettled Hitler. By the end of May 1940, there were discussions in Berlin about the possibility of launching an attack against the Soviet Union by July 1941. The Führer assigned the task of planning the invasion to Franz Halder, who in turn delegated the mission to Erich Marx. However, until the last moment, Adolf Hitler tried to exhaust the diplomatic route to draw Joseph Stalin into the German sphere. In July 1940, after the Soviet occupation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, the German High Command began planning the attack. This was the birth of Operation Barbarossa, named in honor of Emperor Frederick III. The Third Reich needed to divide its forces and avoid repeating Napoleon Bonaparte's mistake of invading such an extensive country with a single block of soldiers. Various aerial reconnaissance missions were also carried out along the German-Soviet border to understand exactly what they would be facing. Erich Marx's plan envisioned the formation of 2 large army groups advancing from Poland towards Moscow and Kiev. However, this was not the only strategy. There was also the idea of deploying 3 armies, targeting Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev for destruction. From December 3rd to 7th, a Kriegspiel war game was staged to determine which plan would be executed. The second option was ultimately chosen. Incredibly, British intelligence had warned the Soviet Union of the imminent invasion, but Stalin believed it was a desperate attempt by Churchill to pull him into the war alongside the Allies. Even though Soviet spy Richard Sorge provided Moscow with the exact date of the attack, the advance took the Red Army by surprise. The Stavka, the High Command, had not issued any preventive war measures. Joseph Stalin had no doubt that a German-Soviet conflict was inevitable, but he believed that Hitler would not open a second front before finishing the war with Britain. Clearly, the Russian leader overestimated the Führer's patience. Let's return to what was happening on the German front in the weeks leading up to the start of Operation Barbarossa.
As German soldiers now flooded into neighboring Poland, Stalin, desperate to maintain the peace, gave orders that nothing should be done to offend Hitler.
Germany needed millions of soldiers to overcome the powerful Soviet defense. The mobilization of citizens for the armed forces, known as the Wehrmacht, was so massive that it caused a shortage of labor in the country. This recruitment increased the number of troops, but overall worsened the quality of the army, as not everyone had the necessary training. Worse still, Much of the weaponry and equipment provided came from the spoils of previous campaigns. They were outdated platforms that had already been worn down by combat use. In summary, the infantry forces that began the attack on the Soviet Union were no better than those used in previous battles against the West. But that didn't matter. The German army was driven by imperial ambition and a renewed patriotic sentiment, combined with hatred towards the Slavic peoples. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the border to invade the socialist giant, led by Joseph Stalin. There was no declaration of war. It was a direct stab at the heart of Moscow with the intention of ending its power once and for all. Since that June day, Eastern Europe became the stage for some of the bloodiest and most savage battles of World War II, with numerous crimes that horrified the world for years. The coordination between the Wehrmacht's ground and air forces allowed the Germans to quickly defeat the surprised Soviet border garrisons. In less than 24 hours, the Germans managed to advance between 10 and 60 kilometers. In contrast, the Soviet units were poorly coordinated, primarily due to the oversized Red Army, the lack of competent officers, and delays in political response. It was clear that the Third Reich began Operation Barbarossa with a winning hand. But to be victorious, much bloodshed still lay ahead. The Soviet defensive plans were still heavily influenced by the experience of World War I, with all their units spread evenly along the border and very close to it. One of the problems with adopting a defensive position is being able to halt the breakthrough at the point where the attacker can concentrate all their forces. There were no reserve troops in the rear to quickly close the gaps in the front, allowing the Germans to penetrate at full speed once the invasion began. In the following months, the international map of the conflict was reorganized. The Allied and satellite countries of the Third Reich declared war on or severed ties with the Soviet Union. Italy and Romania did so immediately on June 22nd. Within a few days, Slovakia, Finland, Hungary, and Vichy France joined the list of Moscow's enemies. But not all news was bad for Joseph Stalin. The governments of the United Kingdom and the United States declared their support for the Soviet Union. Thus, the final map was formed, pitting the axis of the Third Reich against the Allies.
Hitler's panzers were soon thrusting deep into Soviet territory. Within 2 days, the panzers had penetrated more than 50 miles. Ill-coordinated Red Army counterattacks were swiftly brushed aside.
In the first 5 weeks, the Soviet army lost approximately 1 million soldiers between the regions of the Bug River and the city of Smolensk. Many units were trapped and encircled between the German columns, and soon, with no supplies or communication, they opted to surrender, unaware that their fate lay in the infamous concentration camps. Russian tanks quickly exhausted their supply of armor-piercing ammunition and were powerless to halt the German panzers. However, during Operation Barbarossa, there were no significant clashes between enemy vehicles, as the German divisions were ordered to advance at full speed. This terrifying situation caused panic among the Soviet civilian population, but Moscow's soldiers were unwilling to be subdued by an invading force. Historically, one of the strongest links within the Russian army has been its numerous and tenacious infantry. During Operation Barbarossa, it was the foot soldiers who bore the brunt of the Third Reich's assault. In the first 3 months of the German offensive, the USSR lost over 100 rifle divisions. Many of these soldiers were from the last draft of the spring and had little training. The basic weapon of these troops was the Mosin Nagant 1890-1930 bolt-action rifle, chambered in 7.62 millimeters. It was a robust and accurate platform, complemented by the semi-automatic SVT-40 rifle, also in 7.62 millimeters. With these two weapons, tens of thousands of Germans were brought down while the country organized its defense with powerful state-of-the-art armaments. The introduction of the T-34 was crucial in stopping the advance of the panzers. The Soviet defensive buildup ran parallel to some truly negative symptoms within the Third Reich. The German military industry struggled to supply the troops at a good pace for such a large-scale undertaking. Researcher Martin Kitchen, citing a 1945 article, notes that after the fall of France, the German ruling class entertained the idea that the war was practically over and that the campaign in the East would be very brief. For this reason, no long-term plans were made. According to the article, by December 1941, Germany was producing 30% less armament than the previous year. In contrast, their communist enemy continued to build rifles, artillery pieces, and armored vehicles without pause. From the start of the offensive, some of the most savage crimes of the entire conflict were recorded, extending beyond the battlefield. The Germans considered Slavs to be an inferior race that needed to be exterminated. Additionally, Russian women were sexually abused by German troops, who viewed and execution as a right acquired by the powerful Third Reich. Each conquered town was subsequently destroyed, leaving no trace that people had ever lived there. At the same time, famine campaigns were carried out, destroying food supplies for the Russian populations. The goal was to eliminate them from the face of the earth, subjecting them to the worst of miseries. Due to these macabre aspects, some historians consider Operation Barbarossa an attempt to annihilate the entire Soviet people. After a brief illness that kept Hitler away from meetings with the Army General Staff, an internal crisis erupted within the Third Reich. Contrary to what his generals advised, the Führer did not consider capturing Moscow a priority for dominating the Soviet Union. On August 18th, a group of advisors tried to persuade Hitler to resume the offensive against the capital. They needed to act immediately, as the soldiers were unprepared for the harsh winter, which begins at that latitude 5 weeks earlier than in Ukraine. They believed that concentrating troops would enable them to finally capture Moscow. Hitler, however, countered that the panzer divisions were advancing too far from the infantry and were ineffective at encircling the enemy, who frequently managed to escape from the encircling maneuvers. To settle the matter, Hitler issued Directive No. 34, ordering a halt to the advance on Moscow and transitioning to a defensive posture, holding the ground already conquered. This mistake proved fatal for millions of soldiers. As time passed, the German offensive line became increasingly dispersed, diluting the effective power of their troops. Despite the initial impact and the significant victories achieved in the first month of Operation Barbarossa, Soviet morale had recovered, and by August, there were signs of a significant strategic improvement. The defensive positions established from Moscow were becoming increasingly effective in delaying the advance of the Third Reich. At the same time, the difficulty in delivering supplies to the front lines endangered millions of Germans who lacked the food and ammunition necessary to continue advancing. This attrition process intensified over the weeks as the young Germans ventured into a country they did not know and had completely underestimated. However, one of the worst enemies of the Third Reich was not found in the military halls of Moscow. It was something much more raw and unstoppable.
But the real obstacle to German advance would be the weather. On October the 8th, heavy rains set in. German vehicles soon became bogged down in a sea of mud.
With the autumn cold, the German supply lines were completely broken, with tens of thousands of soldiers, their horses, and their vehicles trapped in remote areas. The ground gradually began to be covered with snow, and nights became a torment for anyone without blankets or thick clothing to endure the low temperatures. As the weeks went by, conditions worsened for Hitler's men. The brutal Russian winter arrived, rendering a portion of the German armament unusable. The Führer had expected the offensive to be a matter of weeks and had not anticipated the need for special equipment for the cold. Another advantage was that Soviet soldiers were prepared to survive the Siberian temperatures. Delayed in their objectives and with the harsh Russian winter settling in, the German troops and their allies took Kiev and besieged Leningrad. But a Soviet counteroffensive halted them 80 kilometers from Moscow and nearly caused the collapse of the invading armies. The failure of Barbarossa sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The German forces achieved significant victories, occupied some key economic areas of the Soviet Union, and inflicted numerous casualties on the Red Army. Despite these early successes, the German offensive stalled at the Battle of Moscow in late 1941, and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensive pushed them back about 250 kilometers. The Germans had expected a rapid collapse of their enemy, as had occurred during the invasion of Poland, but the Russians were able to withstand the heaviest blows from the German Wehrmacht. The conflict thus bogged down into a war of attrition, for which the Germans were not prepared. After this defeat, the weakened forces of the Third Reich were no longer able to conduct major attacks along the entire Eastern Front. Subsequent offensives to regain the initiative and penetrate deep into Soviet territory, such as Operation Blue in 1942 and Operation Citadel in 1943, ultimately failed, resulting in the retreat and final collapse of Berlin's army. Of course, the effects were not only political. The brutality of these battles was reflected in an unprecedented death toll. Combining both fronts, approximately 600,000 people, both civilians and military personnel, died. It was a bloodbath that affected the demographics of the warring parties and shaped the course of the war until its conclusion in 1945. The Jewish population in territories belonging to the Soviet Union also suffered a severe blow. The German special troops, known as Einsatzgruppen, were ordered to annihilate them, and they did so. Nearly 2.5 million Jews were murdered in pogroms, executions, or by being sent to concentration camps. This figure is brutal. Considering the total number of Jewish deaths was 6 million, this means that around 40% resulted from Operation Barbarossa. The importance of this offensive in the final outcome of World War II is still debated today. For many, Hitler was naive to think he could invade the Soviet Union in record time, not only underestimating its organizational capability and fierce army, but also the relentless climate. Others argue that the problem was not the attack itself, but the delay in invading the socialist neighbor. By 1941, Stalin's government was in the midst of modernization and already had the means to repel the enemy. Perhaps in 1939, the story might have been different. And you? In the year 1945, everyone already knew that Germany was going to lose the war. The Allied forces were approaching Berlin, the last Nazi stronghold from the west, while the Soviets were sweeping through the territory from the east. The city was being bombed daily. Its population was in panic, its troops demoralized, and opinions among the German high command were divided. Hitler and his most loyal men still believed in a miraculous victory, while their more pragmatic generals began to form plans for escape or surrender. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the confrontation that marked the end of the Second War in Europe, the Battle of Berlin in full color. Since the end of the Battle of Stalingrad in February 1943, German forces had begun to lose territory. the Soviets were advancing through previously conquered countries at great speed. Combined with the Allied invasion of Europe in June 1944, Germany's situation was desperate. Adolf Hitler was behaving increasingly erratically, issuing orders he would later contradict or demanding impossible feats from his generals. The Führer knew that his only chance of victory was to catch the Allies off guard. In December 1944, Germany launched what would be its last major offensive. Known as the Battle of the Bulge, Axis troops managed to surprise their enemies and break through the stagnant front. But the Allies were able to contain the advance, and a month later, the attack had ended. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Second World War. The German army suffered over 75,000 casualties, and its air force was extremely weakened. From this clash, the Nazis began a retreat that would not stop until the end of the war. Let's now listen to a historian talk about this battle.
The German attack in the Ardennes could have hit a number of U.S. units, but it hit a completely green one, and that unit melted away in the face of the German attack, and now there's a hole where the U.S. defenses used to be.
But despite the clearer path, Berlin was no longer a target for the Allies. They knew the Soviets were closing in, and believed that if both armies attacked the city simultaneously, there would be a great risk of friendly fire. Eisenhower, the leader of the Allied forces in Europe, had promised Stalin he could have the city. Discarding plans for a ground operation, they resorted to aerial bombardment. Starting from 1945, American and British planes began an extensive series of over 80 air raids. At one point, the Royal Air Force bombed the city for 36 consecutive days. The damage caused was extensive. Massive fires destroyed much of the buildings. Tens of thousands of Berliners died, and many more found their homes destroyed. Despite this, the greatest danger for the Germans came from another direction. The Soviets, fueled by a terrible thirst for revenge, were rapidly advancing along the Eastern Front, which stretched over 1,000 kilometers long. By mid-1944, they were already in Poland, the last stop before entering Germany. As they marched, the Soviets encountered evidence of the brutal war crimes perpetrated by the Nazis. In 1944, the first concentration camp, Lublin Majdanek, was liberated. Although it had been evacuated, the Germans did not have time to eliminate all evidence of their crimes. Thousands of prisoners were still there, living witnesses to the atrocities committed by the Nazis. From these discoveries, the chief of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, ordered that all prisoners in camps who could be liberated by the Soviet advance had to be transported inland to the Reich. This was not only because the Germans needed prisoners for forced labor, but also because they did not want more evidence of their crimes to fall into the hands of their enemies. But there was also another secret reason. Himmler suspected that Germany had no chance of winning the war anymore. The Nazi leader thought that, if necessary, he could use the detainees as hostages, bargaining chips with the Allies. Hitler couldn't find out. Any German showing a defeatist spirit risked being shot. The first transports of prisoners were carried out by trains or ships. However, as winter approached, they began to be done on foot. These transfers became known as the death marches. The detainees, weakened by months or years of inhuman conditions, malnourished and beaten, often could not endure the journey. SS guards were ordered to kill those who were unable to keep walking. Thousands were murdered during these marches. Many others died of hunger, exhaustion, or exposure to cold and snow. In January 1945, the most infamous of these marches took place. 9 days before the Soviets reached Auschwitz, 55,000 prisoners were forced to walk 56 kilometers in the harsh Polish winter. Between 9,000 and 15,000 died or were murdered. The survivors were sent to other detention centers to continue being tortured or to work until death. Although the advance of both the Soviets and the Allies liberated concentration camps, preventing these crimes from remaining hidden, the marches continued until the end of the war. We can now hear the testimony of a survivor.
Salimos 1000 y pico y llegamos 300. ¿Llegamos a dónde, me vas a preguntar? El transporte de la muerte, yo únicamente en la marcha a la muerte, me acuerdo que otra vez utilicé mi política defensiva. No fui adelante, no fui atrás, no fui en el extremo izquierdo, en la extrema derecha ni extrema. Me mantenía dentro de lo posible amontonado con todo para no recibir un bayonetazo en el costado, para que no me maten atrás porque no puedo más.
The largest defensive line remaining to Germany outside of Berlin was the Seelow Heights, just 90 kilometers from the capital. Here, Soviet and Nazi troops clashed on April 16, 1945. The battle was one of the fiercest of the war and the last pitched battle. The Germans had a good defensive position thanks to the terrain, but the Russians greatly outnumbered them in men and tanks. After 3 days and despite the high number of casualties, the Red Army troops led by General Zhukov managed to break through the defenses. Berlin was now just one step away. On April 20th, the day Hitler turned 56, Soviet artillery began a terrible bombardment of the city. The citizens of Berlin, taken by surprise by the proximity of their enemy, panicked. They weren't the only ones. While German soldiers were ordered to resist to the death or be executed for cowardice, several high-ranking Nazi officers began to plan their escape. In an effort to create a positive image before their enemies, Himmler ordered on April 21st the release of around 20,000 Jews from some concentration camps. In a meeting with members of the World Jewish Congress a few days later, he lied, saying that the crematoria in these centers were built to dispose of the dead from a typhus epidemic. Furthermore, he claimed that these places had a high survival rate, although each person released showed evidence to the contrary. Through Swedish intermediaries, he posed as the provisional leader of Germany, declaring that Hitler would be dead in the coming days and sought to surrender to the Americans. Eisenhower rejected this request, calling Himmler Germany's greatest war criminal. Meanwhile, German troops tried to contain the advancing Soviet forces in the Berlin suburbs, but the small number of soldiers, the poor equipment they had, and the low morale could not withstand the Red Army. Hitler, with his most loyal staff and his lover Eva Braun, was in an underground bunker in the city center. The Führer was in a state of delirium and still imagined that victory was possible. He ordered General Steiner to launch a counterattack that, according to the Nazi leader, would put Zhukov's forces on the ropes. On April 22nd, when he was informed that Steiner did not have the men or materials for such a task, Hitler concluded that everything was indeed lost. In a fit of rage, he blamed his generals for incompetence and treason. Ignoring his men's pleas to flee the city, he declared that he would not leave Berlin until the battle was over. This tirade was portrayed in one of the most famous scenes of the 2004 movie, Downfall.
Steiner konnte nicht genügend Kräfte für einen Angriff massieren. Der Angriff Steiner ist nicht erfolgt.
By April 23rd, the Russians were at the gates of the city center. Just over 80,000 Germans, including army, SS, and militia, were facing off against 1.5 million Soviets energized by the imminent victory. The Nazis had no chance. Many, despite orders to fight to the end, laid down their weapons. Others, however, fueled by blind fanaticism, hindered the enemy's advance. Among them were members of the Hitler Youth, boys and girls indoctrinated from an early age to idolize their leader and give their lives for him. Tens of thousands of them died during the street fighting in Berlin. The German forces were not enough to stop the Soviet advance, and the siege of the city was completed. The Nazis were completely surrounded. Helmuth Weidling, the general in charge of the defense forces, pleaded with the Führer to order an attack to break the encirclement. Hitler turned a deaf ear, oscillating between imagining that everything would go well and moments of anguish when he realized there was no hope. In the following days, while desperate Germans fought with all they had, the Soviets gradually approached the government district of Berlin. We can now hear the words of a historian.
Hitler's subordinates are entirely divorced from the reality on the ground because Hitler is divorced from the reality on the ground. Hitler does not comprehend that two Soviet army groups are smashing into the center of Berlin.
On April 28th, a report from the BBC informed of Himmler's attempts to negotiate peace with the Allies. When Hitler found out, he flew into a terrible rage, declaring it the greatest betrayal he had ever known. He stripped the leader of the SS of all his ranks and ordered that he be shot. His representative in Berlin, Hermann Fegelein, had tried to flee some time before, but he was discovered and arrested. Upon learning of the disloyalty of someone he had considered his most faithful subject, Hitler ordered his death. Not even being Eva Braun's brother-in-law saved him. In the early hours of April 29th, Russian troops came face to face with the deteriorated Reichstag building, the former seat of the German government. Capturing it would hold a symbolic value for the Soviets, similar to what the fall of Paris was for the Nazis at the beginning of the war. But it wouldn't be easy. Inside were fanatical groups of SS troops with nothing to lose. They knew that falling into Soviet hands was almost a death sentence. After a day of fierce fighting, the red flag was raised on the building's terrace. At the same time the Reichstag fell into Soviet hands, just a kilometer away, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun in their underground bunker. The Führer knew the end was near. His last military order was to give Weidling permission to try to break the Russian siege. After poisoning his dog, he retired to his study with Eva Braun. Minutes later, the remaining personnel in the bunker heard a gunshot. On April 30th, 1945, the Nazi leader died. He had instructed his followers that his and his wife's corpses should be cremated and buried, as he didn't want his enemies to display them as war trophies. He sought to avoid the same fate as Mussolini, whose body had been mutilated by Italian partisans. Thus ended his 1,000-year Reich. It had lasted only 12, but it caused the deaths of over 75 million human beings. His remains would be discovered shortly afterward by the Soviets, although it wasn't until 1973 that they could confirm his identification. The Allies never found out, leading to various conspiracy theories claiming Hitler was still alive. They gained access to this information after the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's now listen to the testimony of a historian speaking about this.
Почему Сталин не сообщает союзникам?
Warum ließ Stalin seine Verbündeten im Dunkeln?
Здесь больше психологии,
Das ist
может
etwas
быть, чем,
kompliziert und hat psychologische
формальной
Gründe.
логики. Psychologisch,
Ein Wissensvorsprung ist
знать
stets
то,
von
что не
Vorteil.
знают другие, это всегда хорошо.
Es kann immer nützlich sein, ein
Обладать тайной,
Geheimnis zu
которой не
haben.
обладают другие, это всегда хорошо.
Hitler's successor was his friend and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. The new chancellor rejected the Soviet demand for unconditional surrender, ordering the battered and few remaining German troops that Berlin must be defended to the last drop of blood. One day after the Führer's death, Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children with cyanide while they slept. Then they committed gunshot. Their bodies were also burned. With Goebbels off the stage, perhaps the last staunch fan of the Nazi Party, Weidling saw no reason for his men to continue fighting a lost war. On the morning of May 2nd, the German troops laid down their arms. Thus, the Battle of Berlin came to an end. It left a balance of approximately 80,000 Soviet and 100,000 German dead. The civilians who lost their lives were more than 120,000. The Red Army, hungry for revenge for the brutal actions of the Nazis in their territory, committed atrocities against the population. In addition to the multiple looting and destruction, it is estimated that between 90 and 130,000 women were raped in Berlin. Many thousands would end up committing due to the trauma caused. The city also faced a food shortage that the Soviets could not solve. Due to the havoc caused by bombing and urban battle, more than 1 million people had been left homeless. Let's listen to the testimony of a German survivor below.
And then they came downstairs to the basement, putting this cardboard on the table, telling the people in Berlin, Väterchen Stalin, gave his troops the right to rape, to steal, to kill, to do whatever they want to do. And believe me, they did.
The Axis forces would continue fighting in the remaining conquered territories until May 8th, with the unconditional surrender of Germany on this day. After 6 long and bloody years, the war in Europe was over. But there was still work to be done on this front. Hundreds of Nazi generals and leaders had fallen into the hands of their enemies. Most of these would be tried in Nuremberg, but some had escaped. With Hitler and Goebbels dead, Heinrich Himmler became the most wanted by the Allied forces. After the failure of his attempts to achieve peace, he sought to hide from both the Allies and the Nazis. He changed his appearance, cutting his hair and mustache, hiding his glasses, and putting on a black eye patch. He posed as Sergeant Heinrich Hitzinger, a secret police agent who he himself had ordered shot for defeatism. Still in Germany, he was stopped at a checkpoint by 2 Soviets who suspected there was something strange about his behavior. On May 23, 1945, he handed him over to the British, and after routine interrogation, Himmler revealed his true identity. He insisted on speaking with the Allied leaders, but his requests fell on deaf ears. When a doctor was ordered to give him a checkup, Himmler bit down on the cyanide capsule he had hidden in his mouth. Within 15 minutes, he was lifeless. With Himmler's and the capture of other high-ranking leaders such as Hermann Göring and Karl Dönitz, the leadership of the Third Reich had collapsed. Despite what the German surrender meant, the atmosphere in the Reich capital was not happy. Unlike many other regions under Nazi control, Berlin was not liberated but conquered. There were no scenes of emotional celebrations, nor soldiers being welcomed with kisses and flowers. The remaining citizens now had to deal with mourning their dead and rebuilding their lives under the tense joint Allied and Soviet occupation. Still, many Berliners were relieved that the war was finally over, at least on their territory, and that the regime that had plunged them into it was in ruins. In 1944, Paris, considered one of the most beautiful cities in the world, was completely in the hands of the Nazis. Its citizens had already endured 4 years of occupation, 4 years of suffering at the hands of the Germans and their collaborators. But the winds were changing. The Allies had invaded Europe and were defeating the German forces. The crisis of the Germans was visible to all. The French people, always known for their resilience, felt inspired to achieve their long-awaited liberation, with or without Allied help. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about one of the most inspiring events, which occurred during one of the darkest moments in history, the liberation of Paris in full color. For many historians, the fall of France in 1940 was the event where the world became aware of what was to come. The French command and its allies had underestimated Adolf Hitler, and consequently, the country was in his hands. From here, the German government had ample freedom of movement for its conquest campaign, leaving the Allied forces without a strong foothold in continental Europe. France was soon divided, with one half occupied, while the other saw the establishment of the Vichy puppet state. The City of Light fell within the occupied half. The government headquarters shifted to the city of Vichy, but the conquest of the former capital held undeniable symbolic value. Hitler, who considered Paris the most beautiful city in the world, wasted no time in celebrating his victory by touring it. He was seen on the Champs-Élysées, the Arc de Triomphe, and obviously the Eiffel Tower. Let's now watch a video of the Führer strolling with his men through the newly conquered city. The citizens were subjected to rationing of food and other goods, a curfew that forbade movement in the city at night, and the takeover of the media by the Germans, who began circulating propaganda in their favor. Any Parisian who dared to rebel was harshly suppressed. Nevertheless, the Nazis could not prevent the emergence of civilian resistance. These individuals, called maquis, formed clandestine groups that took sabotage actions against the invaders, sometimes even attacking their officers. Some of them were communists, while others were loyal to General Charles de Gaulle, who served as the leader of Free France. Despite their different loyalties, they were united in their goal of expelling the Germans from the city of London. However, they would have to wait a long time for an opportunity. Next, you'll hear the words of a resistance member explaining why they joined the movement.
Si quelqu'un vient chez vous, vous tape dessus, vide votre frigo, bat les gosses et casse tout, qu'est-ce que vous faites si vous êtes quelqu'un d'honorable? Vous les fiches dehors. Hein? Ben, moi, les Allemands, je voulais les fiches d'or. Et la seule façon de les fiches d'or, c'est de les tuer.
The opportunity for the French would come 4 years later. Following the successful Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, the Allies were advancing rapidly into the interior of France. The Germans, desperate, tried by all means to control the advance of their enemies, but they were disorganized, and cities that they had conquered years ago were being liberated by Allied forces. Hitler had ordered that only he would make all military decisions, so the Germans were forced to wait for information to reach Berlin and then return to the front. Thus, while they yielded more and more territory, they found themselves cornered by the troops led by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower. In the Falaise Pocket, almost 2 entire German armies were cornered. Desperate, they were forced to retreat in broad daylight at the mercy of Allied aircraft fire. 50,000 men were captured, and although many tens of thousands were able to escape, they had to leave their tanks and heavy weaponry behind. They no longer had any hope of halting the advance of their enemies. You can see below the testimonies of a German soldier and an American soldier narrating the frantic German escape from the Allied encirclement.
Many stopped in their tracks and tried to find cover, but it wasn't possible because the fire came from all sides.
We were attacking German tank concentrations. It was a continuous attack with very effective results.
Perhaps surprisingly, in the initial plans of the Allies, the liberation of Paris may not have been considered. Entering this city would have slowed down the march towards Berlin, the main objective of the invasion of Europe. Additionally, all the resources required to liberate and protect Paris could have been used on other fronts to bring about the enemy's downfall more quickly. Flanking the city and continuing to advance would have left the Nazi garrison installed in the city isolated from the support of the German army. For these reasons, the liberation of Paris did not present a strategic advantage. The French didn't agree with this analysis. They couldn't wait for the fall of Berlin. They needed to expel the invaders from their capital city and destroy the collaborationist Vichy regime. Upon hearing the news of the Allied advance, Parisians were emboldened, sensing that their liberation was near. On August 15, 1944, employees of the Paris Metro and the police decided not to show up for work. 3 days later, workers across the country, led by the French Communist Party, joined in, declaring a general strike. German soldiers suppressed the French employees. There were casualties, but the strike persisted. Meanwhile, radios and newspapers controlled by the French forces of the interior called for a popular civil insurrection. The German garrison, although still significant, was not as numerous, as some troops were fighting on the French front, while others had been withdrawn to protect German territory from a possible future invasion. On August 19th, while the Allied troops still hesitated to enter Paris, real skirmishes began between German soldiers and the French population. Members of the police seized the prefecture and began firing at the occupying forces. Men, women, and children erected barricades in the streets, hindering the movement of Nazi vehicles. Third Reich banners were lowered and replaced by the tricolor flag. Amidst the gunfire, people sang the Marseillaise. the French forces of the interior ordered citizens, "Everyone to the barricades." The liberation of Paris did not begin with an attack by the Allies, but with the uprising of its own people. 1 day later, the military governor of Paris, Dietrich von Choltitz, negotiated a ceasefire with the French resistance. Unaware that the Allies were planning to bypass the city, Choltitz ordered several of his troops to withdraw, seeing it as unlikely that they could successfully defend the city. However, several partisan groups ignored the ceasefire, and attacks continued. On August 22nd, the fighting in Paris intensified. The Germans began to counterattack, openly firing at the civilian population. The Grand Palais, which served as a stronghold for the resistance, was fired upon while tanks cleared the barricades. On August 23rd, Adolf Hitler, furious about the course of the war, ordered Choltitz to inflict maximum damage on the city. He preferred to see one of his favorite cities burn rather than fall into the hands of his enemies. Explosives were placed on numerous bridges and monuments throughout the city. Upon learning that the French resistance was rising against their oppressors, de Gaulle urged American Commander Eisenhower to begin a frontal attack on Paris. The French leader did not want the citizens of Paris to suffer the same fate as the Polish resistance in the Warsaw Uprising, where the Soviets had not come to the aid of the partisans, and they were being crushed by the Nazis. De Gaulle warned Eisenhower that if the rebels were not assisted, the Germans would annihilate them. Additionally, if the rebellion was not intervened in, the French communists would see their position strengthened as they were taking over the leadership of the insurgency. The French even threatened to ignore the chain of command and attack the German garrison solely with their forces if the Allies did not comply with their request. However, despite sympathizing with the Parisian population, Eisenhower turned a deaf ear to his comrades' complaints. On August 24th, General Philippe Leclerc, with de Gaulle's permission, disobeyed his American superior and sent the vanguard of his 2nd Armored Division to Paris. They engaged in combat with the entrenched German troops on the outskirts, forcing them to retreat. Leclerc's insubordinate maneuver forced the hand of the Allies. Believing he could not stop the French from liberating their capital, Eisenhower ordered the other divisions to assist the soldiers of Free France. Meanwhile, civilians celebrated Leclerc's entry. They sang the national anthem, accompanied the tanks' march, and bells rang in the churches. Soldiers received kisses, flowers, and bottles of wine. You can see below the testimonies of military and civilians from those days.
They had set up an old-fashioned record player, the kind with the big flared horn. And a man came out and he started La Marseillaise.
And my grandmother at that time called me, and she had prepared a basket with fresh and raw apples in it. So I took that and I gave it to him, and I had my first chocolate that day.
Wonderful, wonderful. They give you a kiss and hug, and they give you the wine. They had some of the best wine you could drink too, So it was a joyous time.
On the morning of August 25th, Allied troops continued to advance. Leclerc's division entered through the Porte d'Orléans, while La Neuve, a company mostly composed of Republican veterans from the Spanish Civil War, entered through the Porte d'Italie. The Americans, led by General Leonard T. Jarrow, followed shortly after, heading to the Paris City Hall to reinforce the resistance of the French forces of the interior. Choltitz knew he had no chance of defending the city. Most of his troops had withdrawn, leaving only 20,000 soldiers who now faced not only the Allies, but also 3 million empowered Parisians hungry for freedom. The main dilemma for the German general lay elsewhere. Should he obey the Führer and destroy Paris, or would he disobey? While he decided what to do, he informed his superiors of non-existent maneuvers, although the idea of surrender was already forming in his mind. Supposedly, at the same time that the Allied attack advanced towards the city center, Hitler called Choltitz and asked, "Is Paris burning?" His response is not known. In the afternoon, Choltitz's headquarters was assaulted, and the German commander was taken prisoner. Around 3 p.m., in front of General Leclerc, Choltitz signed the surrender of the German occupation forces. After 4 long years, Paris was free. Choltitz, for disobeying Hitler's orders became known as the Savior of Paris. According to him, destroying the city would have been an evil and shameful act against a city that is a cradle of culture. However, the French resistance declared that executions and repressions against the Parisian population continued until just hours before the surrender of the German contingent. For them, the city was saved because Choltitz knew that a Nazi victory was impossible and did not want himself and his men to suffer possible reprisals from the Maquis. The streets of the city exploded in scenes of celebration. Entire blocks were turned into dance floors, music played for entire nights, kisses were freely given to the liberators and the resistance fighters without any restraint. Charles de Gaulle addressed the French people on the radio and delivered a speech that will be remembered for posterity. Let's listen to a well-known excerpt from it below, allowing us to use a black and white video, as its epicness is worth it.
Paris, Paris outragé, Paris brisé, Paris martyrisé, mais Paris libéré, libéré par lui-même, libéré par son peuple avec le concours des armées de la France, avec l'appui et le concours de la France tout entière, c'est-à-dire de la France qui se bat, c'est-à-dire de la seule France, de la vraie France, de la France éternelle.
However, we must say not everything was a celebration those days. The Nazi occupation in France left serious and deep wounds in its population. Since its invasion in 1940, hundreds of thousands of French citizens were forcibly taken to Germany, made to work in factories, farms, railways, etc., to benefit the Nazi war effort. The Germans also seized around 20% of French food production, leading to widespread food shortages. The Germans also seized around 20% of French food production, leading to widespread food shortages. 49 concentration camps were built on French soil, where the Jewish population was sent. Over 77,000 died during the war, nearly a quarter of its total population. All these crimes led to French retaliation shortly after liberation. The Nazis who had occupied Paris had already withdrawn, or had been taken prisoner, so the vengeance fell upon the collaborators. Women accused of consorting with the Germans were violently shaved and publicly displayed for the amusement of others. Informers, merchants who conducted business with the invaders, writers, and journalists who advocated collaboration were in many cases executed without trial by French civilians and partisans. Sometimes the severity of the act didn't seem to matter, and mere suspicion was enough for condemnation. It is estimated that in the days following the liberation of Paris, the resistance murdered 20,000 people in French territory. For many, these acts of retribution were not far removed from the atrocities committed by the Germans, and were a stain on what was the glorious liberation of Paris. For others, they were completely justified, as each of the executed individuals collaborated with the regime that terrorized not only France, but almost the entire world. There were also political trials. Philippe Pétain, hero of the First World War where he earned the nickname Lion of Verdun, was the one who signed the armistice with Germany in 1940. In his words, to prevent the destruction of France's rich heritage, he urged the people to collaborate with the Germans. He was found guilty of treason, and only de Gaulle's personal intervention prevented his execution. Nevertheless, he spent the rest of his days in prison. Pierre Laval, the Prime Minister of Vichy France, was not so lucky. After the war, he was executed by firing squad. For most French people, August 25th was a glorious day. In the days that followed, the Allies marched with their victorious troops throughout Paris, starting from the Arc de Triomphe and proceeding down the Champs-Élysées. It is estimated that 2 million people witnessed the parade, 2/3 of the city's population. De Gaulle's victory legitimized his provisional government, replacing the fallen Vichy France and uniting communists, anarchists, nationalists, and others under his banner, at least for a time. Below, we can see the people's celebrations in the recovered streets of Paris.
The thrilling music of the Marseillaise takes on new meaning. deliverance has come so suddenly to these people, they are slow to realize the nightmare of occupation is over. This is but a foretaste of things to come as the Allies move forward. The V for victory sign, once the symbol of a hope, is now a reality.
While Paris was free, much of France still remained in the hands of the Germans. Resistance pockets persisted in the country until the end of the war. But, just as the fall of the city was a harbinger of the dark years to come, its liberation appeared as the light at the end of a long and distressing tunnel. We've reached the end of the video, and we'd like to ask you, do you believe the actions of the resistance towards collaborators were justified? Leave your answer in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.